obsession, addiction, if you want to call it, with fantasy sports. Us men in our late 30s or 40s who have family, but we are spending substantial amount of time on fantasy sports, and at the end of the day, regretting that we have spent that time and have not been productive. Louis, something that you can probably relate to.
What a funny guy. Yeah, I can relate to it because I do love my fantasy sports. I love fantasy football. And I think this conversation is more of a debate slash conversation because I think too often we may blur the lines between what's passion versus what's obsession. And in the context of that comparison, fantasy football is a great example because I am totally addicted to the statistics, the articles, the podcasts, all the information to be a better fantasy quote unquote manager, looking at rosters, making lineup decisions, looking at the waiver wire, all those things. And some people might think that, look, at the end of the day, it takes away from being productive doing other things around the house or professionally that matter quite a bit more than fantasy sports.
So how has that worked out for you?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's impacted my productivity universally, but I think that's due in part to just a lack of organization and the effort to maybe structure my day so that I can edge out some time to scratch that itch.
So I think today Louis and I are going to be somewhat on the opposite side of the spectrum, where Louis will be more in favor of how one can continue to pursue being involved with fantasy sports while also take care of their family, where I will be more so advocating for how we can scale it back a little bit in favor of more important and productive and meaningful things in life. But Lou, go ahead. I mean, what is your take? What are you suggesting to those men who are obsessed with fantasy sports, DraftKings, DFS? What do you recommend to them?
Take a step back and think about exactly what you hope to gain from participating in these exercises. Like, is it just purely for the enjoyment of watching football on another level? Is it to communicate with fellow friends and family that maybe you haven't spoken to in quite some time? Is it all about the money? Sometimes there's a lot of competitions out there that involve a pretty penny. Sometimes so much so that someone could profit off of doing fantasy sports or daily fantasy. Or is it just to have time pass by? I think by taking a step back and evaluating which one of those buckets this falls into, it'll help you to better determine how you spend your time and determining, is this a passion of yours or is this something that you're kind of just obsessing over? Because I think the difference between obsessing and being passionate about something has to do with the level of distraction you've identified in that activity. Is it a distraction? Is it considered white noise? Or is it something that can be actually beneficial to you? Because certain activities that we perform in a day in, day out basis are sometimes out of necessity or sometimes out of want, right? And if they're out of want, then they probably fulfill you in a certain way that can't be achieved with other things. And that's okay. I think that's why I think fantasy sports is here to stay. That's why I think it's had such an impact on people's lives. And even though there's certainly maybe more of a negative side tied to it where it just impacts work productivity and that's the end of it, it could really contribute to someone's overall happiness. So I think my first point is, take a step back, determine what category it goes into, and then this will give you a better idea on where it is in your life as a priority.
And Louis, you also, because we have talked about it prior to the show, you have taken it another step where you have suggested that maybe you can make it a productive activity, or maybe you can start writing a blog, or maybe you can create your own podcast. If you are so fascinated and you're so passionate about fantasy sports, fantasy football, fantasy baseball, whatever, maybe you can write a blog, have a podcast. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all about, in that example, substantiation, right? How do you substantiate what you're doing on a day out, day out basis, day in, day out basis? And so, with regard to your point, which was my point earlier offline when we spoke, someone can make this a part of their career. Someone could make this a hobby that expands upon making money or spreading knowledge toward other people who are in need of it. So if it's blogging, if it's writing a book, writing a magazine article, participating in a podcast, creating a podcast.
And by the way, Lewis and I are in the same fantasy football league. In contrast to Lou, over the years, I have cut down on the amount of time that I spend towards fantasy research. Granted, I still do some research. I do listen to fantasy podcast at night before going to bed. But that's about all I do. Over the course of the last few years, as our family has grown, I have significantly cut down the time to even watch football, because it used to be on Sundays. I would not go to my friend's house. If our family or relatives were inviting me, I would not go to their home. Neither would I invite anybody over, because I wanted to be able to just sit and watch football. But again, that has changed for me now. In many sense, priorities have changed. Whenever passion becomes obsession, that is a signal that it's time to intervene from my standpoint. Coming to, activities like writing a blog or a podcast specifically geared towards fantasy sports, well, my thing would be, if that aligns with your values, your core values and meaning and purpose that you're all about, if that aligns with it, fine, then have at it. I would ask every individual, including you, to go through that exercise of putting yourself at the age of 70, 80, and what advice would that 70-year-old Lewis give to a 35-year-old Lewis at this time, right? If it is that, hey, Lou, continue to spend that time on fantasy sports, do what you're doing, or spend time doing more podcasts and blogs. Okay, then I guess you have a more aligned activity with your values. But if it's otherwise, at the age of 70, again, then you may have to kind of scale back, is what I'm saying.
Asking your 70 or 80-year-old self about fantasy sports is interesting. Probably they would say, hey, listen, not the most productive way to spend your time, but I think also that 70, 80-year-old self would be like, what are the things in life you get enjoyment out of? Because enjoying your life and enjoying the time you have on this earth, I think is pretty important.
If it's just simply a pastime, a hobby that makes you feel good, like, eating chocolate makes you feel good, but it also over time makes me fat. But it's not all about just it makes me feel good and that's why I'm continuing it. Does eating chocolate align with my core value? If my core value is to live a healthy lifestyle, maybe I would say, yeah, not the whole bar, but maybe maybe a square of the chocolate, maybe a square of a Cadbury to be eaten at a time, rather than consuming all of it in a day. And that's how I'm kind of seeing fantasy sports. Rather than consuming all of that data in a 16-hour day or a 12-hour day, you have, chalk out maybe an hour or two, and whatever you can get out of it, great. And if you can't, then, you dedicate that time towards more valuable things that aligns with your purpose and meaning in life.
I think it's kind of a stretch to compare fantasy football to a piece of chocolate. I mean, first of all, you were making me hungry. Number one. Number two,
bananas right behind you. You can have them.
It's not necessarily to say that your core values line up with fantasy football. It's more so, does fantasy football line up with your core values? So at the end of the day, is a core value of yours helping people, right? And therefore, if you're using fantasy football to help people, then it lines up with your core values. So why not do it? If a core value,
you're inviting more people to be dependent and obsessed. You're inviting them over. Hey, here, have more of this stuff.
You make me laugh. I mean, look, it's all how you look at it. It's all about the angles. It's all about the angles. I'm helping those people to be successful doing something that they enjoy doing. I don't know what person in their right mind gets enjoyment out of losing every single week or not sounding very competent when they talk about something such as a pastime that they enjoy doing. So, or enjoy watching. So with that said, if you have a value, if you have the value of being very analytical or statistical and like you get enjoyment over those things, I would think that 70, 80-year-old self would say, listen, don't let time pass you by and you're not enjoying your life and enjoying the things that make you smile. If of all things, something as small as fantasy football makes you smile on a Sunday to say, hey, I'm going to watch some sports and enjoy watching players play for at least a few hours out of your day, I think that's a small price to pay in the big scheme of life if it's going to make you feel good. But yeah, look, I think the structuring of time is probably your best strategy.
For me, not just fantasy football, let me just specify it even more, football in general. I find a lot of lessons. I can draw a lot of lessons from football. And I've made a number of references in my YouTube videos in the past. One of them, in my last video, I talked about the 2005 Pittsburgh Steelers, who, despite of their obstacles, they did not give up, right? They kept going on. They came back. They won a number of games to barely make it to the playoffs to become the Super Bowl champion. So there are some lessons to be learned that we could apply in our own personal lives about, hard work, about practice, about training, about discipline. So that is what I find to be beneficial. Obviously, it's no secret to my friends who know me that I'm a huge New England Patriots fan, and that is because I am a huge fan of the way they approach the game and how disciplined they are, and it's well known to the entire league. So for me, it's not just about watching the game, but it's also the tangibles that come out of football, watching football, that is, right? And as far as, again, fantasy football is concerned, yes, it gives me joy, but I also try to get other values out of it. So one of them being immediate versus delayed gratification. So, when you're a fantasy football owner, you have the ability to pick up a player, and you have to give up a certain amount of fake money, which is fab. We call it fab, right? So you're practicing. In many ways, you're practicing good financial skills by doing that. Over the years, I'm training myself. I'm not sure where I'm at right now, but I'm trying to not be connected to people or situations that are impermanent in many cases, right? So fantasy football, they are football because it goes by football season. So football season lasts for about 3 months, and I can sense my mood sort of kind of dropping and me being kind of sad, by the time January comes around or end of December. And I don't want to feel that way recurrently. Of course, you can then prepare for the next season, but the next season doesn't start until maybe closer to August, right? Of course, I have to train myself, so I cannot be dependent. I don't want to have myself be connected, dependent on objects or things that are in many cases impermanent. I bet there are other things that, fall in. For example, let's just say your wife and son wanted to go out, and it is 1 o'clock Sunday. Or it's a beautiful day. It's been raining for the last 6 days. Sunday happens to be the one nice day, you can go out with them to spend time. What would you do? Would you say, what, today's fantasy football, or today's football day, I'm going to actually set that time aside to watch football? Or would you say, what, I don't want to regret, this time with my family and loved one years from now. So I want to go ahead, even if it's a half hour out, 45 minutes out, I'm going to choose family or football.
I would go outside and take a walk in the morning. I would be able to fit it all in the same day, by enjoying the weather outside and going for a walk with my son and my wife and having an opportunity to chat and talk and enjoy the weather, and then maybe run a couple errands, and then it's football Sunday.
I was gonna say maybe I should have framed this question much better. With all things being equal, if we had to choose over taking our family out versus watching football, what would we do?
It's a tough one, man. I can't necessarily answer that question in one way or another, and here's why. Okay, everyone's situation is different. In my household, all three of us, my 2-year-old son included, we get excited about watching football on Sundays. We all put on jerseys and watch the Jets play, as horrible as they are. And we're watching all the other games as well. So we enjoy it. We'll make food, make lunch, for it, and collectively just enjoy our afternoons around the game of football. We may, in between the 1 and 4 o'clock games, go for a walk, just get some blood flow going and enjoy that. And then we'll come back and watch some more football.
I have been trying on my own to see if I can back myself out. Like, for example, last week, they were going to go, my wife was going to meet up with other friends, but we were going to go together for apple picking. I decided to not go, but I think it was just not football, but there were other, I was also maybe not, I was tired. But in any case, I have been on my own trying to, kind of taper down my consumption of football and fantasy sports. And I think that's something that I will continue to do. But whatever amount that I do watch, I try to incorporate other ways that it's complementing my core values. And for me personally, it would not sit right with me and my 70-year-old self if I would have dedicated just the time just to, research fantasy sports and becoming successful. That I know for sure would not sit right with this current self. Even if I would have made some financial gains out of it, unless it was my sole way of earning an income. But otherwise, it would not sit right with my 70-year-old self because life is, as they say, it's short. You have to maximize every moment. And for us, it's for me, it's the family around me that I think I ought to pay attention to the most. And I think that's something that I'm still trying, and I'm not there yet.
Well, the only parting words I would want to share is that, again, finding value in life is important, and some of these things will and will not work for you. I think there's a lot of mentality and thought process around needs and wants, right? And, I've been struggling with that myself, finding out what I need to do versus what I want to do. And sometimes if you want something, you do need to do certain things to get to that desired want. And I think that's what it really comes down to at the end of the day. So whatever that is for you and how it connects the dots in life to your happiness and fulfillment, go for it. I don't think you should be slowed down or pushed back just because maybe it's looked at as insignificant or smaller on other people's radars or priority lists.
So we will pick this up in the near future. Until then, everybody, have yourself a wonderful week and a weekend. God bless you all.
God bless.